Hello once again everyone. I'm posting this short film to show you a few of the elements for the still life that we didn't have a chance to complete at the end of this term. So those of you who want to crack on and finish your work and want a little bit of guidance, these are just some of the things that I would have shown you in the demo in class. The first thing I'm going to concentrate on is adding in some of the greenery. So I've got a whole selection of greens and various brush sizes, and I'm just going to put really simple bits of greenery in between. You can't really see any details, so I'm going to use a small brush and I'm just going to drop some darks in between some of these shapes so that it looks as though we've got abstract darks coming in and out. I'll move up to various brush sizes, and I've got a few different dark greens, so I'm going to put mid-tones down first and then I can drop some darks into that. I think I'll stick with the smaller brush for the moment in between these shapes. Can't really make out what's going on apart from darks. I'm not going to try and put any definition into these little central bits. But while they're still wet, I've then got a much darker green that I've used a little bit of Payne's Grey in, and while it's wet I'm just going to touch those in so that I get a couple of different tones. This is a really strongly mixed green with a lot of Payne's Grey in it. So I'm going to have a couple of different tones. And then as I come lower, I can move up to my bigger brush and go straight in with the darker green. I'm just trying to paint round some of the fine work from the edge of the sunflowers. And I'm just going to finish this off with just shapes, because I'll have background to put in around this, so I don't have to be too specific. So I'll do this, all these small darks in between the foliage that I've established with my light wash. I haven't finished that foliage, it doesn't matter, I can do that before or after. Won't really matter, but I just want to get some of these dark spaces filled. Because this is against the deep coloured cloth, any other spaces will end up getting filled with dark colour anyway, so I don't have to worry too much. Where I've got some leaf shapes, just use some of my mid-tones and drop a little bit of colour in. It's not quite so dark. If you go over any of the details for these sunflowers, you can use gouache to get them back again, so you don't have to be too worried. I can add these in with gouache afterwards. And where I want it to go really dark in a few places, what I'm going to do is use a little bit of pure neutral. And while it's wet, just drop that in. So I'll finish this little section here, and then with some absolutely pure neutral, just in the darkest areas, I can just drop that in here and there. so that you're almost painting negative space. And it gives a little bit of extra depth. So we just get the impression of what's going on behind. Obviously that'd take me a little while to build up, but I then begin to get a sense of depth to the background. So that's the greenery that needs to go through. I hadn't done any in the centre of my sunflowers, so I'll quickly put a little bit of that in. So I've mixed myself a nice warm brown as my first colour that goes down, which I'm just going to drop in, load the brush and fill that central space. Make sure I get a nice uneven edge to it. Let's go in and out of the shapes. And then as I come across, I've got again a bit of neutral that I'm going to start to drop in before it has a chance to dry. Do a little semicircle of neutral. That comes up to the top. And then go back. I've been using sepia, which has got a little bit of burnt sienna in it, but just to give it a slight bit of warmth to it. Quite a strong mix of colour. Keep stopping to load my brush up so that I've got plenty of liquid down on the paper. I don't want it to be too dry, so that I can then drop more neutral in. Okay, and then back to my neutral. Again, make sure that you do a strong enough mix, because this is wet in wet, so this has got to be slightly thicker than the first wash that you put down, and I can carry on touching that into the colour, and I can start to get a little bit of shape. Even though it's quite dark, it'll give me a little bit of shape into the sunflower centre. So that it's not totally flat. And there's a few sort of little outer rings of colour as well. I'll move down to a smaller brush, and I'm just going to stipple with a small brush to get a touch of texture. Do the same in the outer section here as well, just a little bit of stippling. Okay, so I'll need to do that with the other sunflowers as well, but that same technique. Now I've got a couple of leaves which I'll quickly put in. Down the front, some of the leaves are slightly lighter, so I'm going in with a light, very acidic green to begin with as my base colour. And I can wash that down over the entire leaf section and then drop slightly thicker colours into that. So this is the way I would do all of the leaves. So I've got a thicker mixed green, darker green on my small brush, and I can start dropping that colour in. It's more deeply shadowed towards the back. And then I can just touch a bit of colour in. To get some of the shape onto that underside. The sharper you want it to be, the drier it'll need to be, so I can always go back and add more detail in, but I quite like having it slightly looser, the details. So I'm just going to drop some more colour in to the top there. Begin to get the shape developing. Now on the stems, again you're going to get through the vase, you're going to get colour from the background, so what I need to do is I need to paint any colour on the stems in first. So I've got a little bit of reflected orange because it's picking up some of the orange on some of this, so I'm going to just put a touch of orange in on the stem, just a little thin glaze of orange, and then I can start bringing some of my other colours in. More shadowy at the top. But I'm doing it in strips to give some texture to the stems. And when I get to the rim of the vase, I can have a little break for where the rim is. And I'm really looking at it in terms of shapes. So there's a bit of a shape and distortion where it hits the water. And a slight shadow is being cast. The lower stem I need to put, again, a bit more of a hint of orange in. Stem here. So just a thin glaze of colour. And then I've got quite a yellowy green. Again, just breaking it for where the water line is. And the rim of the vase. And at the top here I need to just use a bit of water to blur that out. And a tiny bit of orange coming in at the top. use water to soften the edges. And let that dry. So it's a question of going down each section of stem and looking to see what the tone should be, so of the piece behind. So I can see it should be darker behind, so I can bring some darker washes in. Follow the strips of colour. It should also make a lot more sense when the fabric is in behind it as well. So I've got some very dark greens coming through. So it's a question of building your colours up, just with almost abstract shape, but making your brush marks go in the right direction. For where the stems go. So I would need to finish on building those up, and then we'll worry about putting the cloth in afterwards. So the cloth's really the next stage. I was just going to show you the leaves, the stems. I'll get a bit of the cloth into position as well, but obviously I've still got a lot of work to do in terms of finishing some of the leaves off and working a little bit into the flowers. I have done some of that. You can see I've gone on with a bit of purple on top of some of my flowers just to give a little bit of depth to them. I've put in the centres to some of the gerberas, but others of the flowers I do have a wee bit more work to do. For instance, on the orange flowers over here, I haven't done too much, but what I can do is just work in the odd bit of extra shape, just to hint at some of the petal shapes without painting loads and loads of detail in, just using a brush and dropping a little bit of colour in and then moving it around with some water here and there to give the impression of the tops or the outside edges of some of the petals without painting loads of detail in. I just want to give a bit of shape to add a touch of depth in. More of an impression than anything else. So using a little bit of water to move the colour around for the ends of some of the petals. that's all I'm going to do really to try and keep it a little bit looser. The ones at the bottom, which need to be a bit darker because they go into the shadows, I've just added a touch more red into those, and I'll just put a few strokes over the top to drop them down, give them a touch more depth. You can even use a bit of burnt sienna on that to shadow them slightly. But I think that's all I really want to do. I don't want to overdo it in terms of the amount of detail. I'm just now going to mix up a really large palette of colour, and we'll try and drop some of this background in. Now we get on to potentially the most difficult bit of the still life for those of you who are working against dark material. It is up to you if you want to put the dark material behind. It will obviously look much more dramatic, but it is the most difficult bit of this. So if you decide not to do that, you can go with paler washes behind, but I'm going to try with the darker. I'm going to suggest you turn your work upside down. I am not going to wet the paper. If you wet the paper, it will give you more time, but obviously your colour will be more diluted. So I'm going to go for an option. I have got mixed up, and I'll bring this in to show you. I have got mixed up really dark blues with lots of indigo in there. I've got a couple of different purples mixed, ready to go. I'm not going to go as dark as the photograph, but I am going to go fairly dark, and I'm going to work with a number of brushes. I've got them ready to go. So the first brush, I'm going to start by going in close to the flowers, and I'm going to paint as tight as I can to the edge of the flower with my blue, but I won't go, it will start to dry. I can't afford to let it to dry totally, so I'm going to get to a certain point, and then I'm going to use water and fade the colour in. So you will go over some of the edges of your flowers, there's no way around that, but I'm loading the brush with a fair amount of colour to give me maximum amount of time to go around. But this is really important, not to just have one colour ready. In order to make this more interesting, to have a number of colours ready. So I'm going to get to a certain point and then stop and move the colour about, turn the pad round, so you'll see the screen will go funny while I turn this round. But I'm going to go as far as this gerbera with my colour into that shape. Right, now I'm going to move up to a mid-sized brush and move that colour around with that brush. You can see I've got a lot of colour down, so I'm going to move that around with that brush, and then that gives me a little bit more time to carry on a bit further. So I'll go around here. Go in with as small a brush as you want to come in and out of the flowers, but something with a decent point is really important. Right, what I'm then going to do is I'm going to go into some water, and I'm going to move that colour around with clean water before it has a chance to dry. Bearing in mind my paper is at an angle, and I'm going to fade that colour right out with water, and then go back to painting in. I'm not going to do the whole of this background to show you in one go, because I want to build up some sections of it, but I'll do a fair bit. You will get some edges. You are going to get some edges, but hopefully some of the edges you get, you'll be able to lose in the creases in the fabric. Now obviously I'm trying to do this fairly quick, so I am going to go over some of the petals, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. While this is wet, I can drop more colour in while I've got this moist. Now I'm going to turn this round so it's going the other way. I will get cauliflowers forming because I've turned this up the wrong way, or the right way I should say. But I'm going to drop some more colour into that top section. And start moving this around with water. I'm going to go to a really much bigger brush now. And I'm now going to pick up some of my purples, purpley tones, purpley blues, and I'm going to start dropping some of that in, looking at the direction that some of these folds begin to go in. Sort of alternate between moving the colour in and out. Pick up some purples and I'm going to start putting some of the scoops of the fabric in my purple tones. Bear in mind you've got to make the thickness of the paint that bit more if you're going to start trying to put shapes in, so that you don't get totally cauliflowers everywhere. What I will need to do is to get to a point where I allow this to dry, and then I can actually paint some of the creases in on top. I'm not worrying about the interior bits because I can do those later when all the outside is dried. So I'm just going to bring in the dark. This is by far the trickiest bit to do. If you're not confident and you've left too many little gaps, you can always use gouache to reinstate the edges of your petals later. But I'm just going to move down to a smaller brush and just, now I've got a little bit of time, just go in with my smaller brush and lose some of the bits of white paper that I don't want. I don't mind that I'm going over some of the petals. I can just get a sharper shape. So I'm going to carry on doing this off camera, otherwise I'll use up too much of the film. I'll get a little bit further off camera and then I'll go back and show you how to put some of the folds into the cloth on top. Now I hope you can see I've got all my dark washes in at the top. I'll just concentrate on that section, and they've now dried. There are some cauliflowers, but I have tried to drop different colours in. You can see the purples and the indigos coming through. Now it's dry, I'm going to work on top with a thicker colour, and I'm going to try and get the impression of some of the folds in the paper, folds in the fabric. So onto the watercolour paper, I'm going to use a big brush and wash a line for where I'm going to suggest some of the fabric is folding. Use some water on the brush and then soften the edge with water. So that I begin to get the effect of some sweeps in the fabric. And then on the other side I can do something similar. And then use some water to sweep fabric folds down. While that bit's still wet, I can drop some more colour on the inside of it. A little bit of water to soften some edge. Move to the centre, and I'm just going to try and do a similar thing in the middle. Move to a slightly smaller brush with some water on it. So sort of leaving it a hard line on one side, more or less, and then using clean water just to fade out on the other side. And then I'll change the fold a little bit here, I think. And you can add as much or as little as you want to. I'll just come down to the bottom and put a few strokes into the bottom just to get the impression of a few folds into this. Back to my big brush, I think, and I'll just move it around with the big brush. Pick up a bit of water, and I think on this one I'm just going to lose that brightness by running some water across. So on top of that initial wash that you did, you can then mess around with your darks and lights and putting folds and creases in. I'm just going to drop some more dark in at the back here. Some more of my indigo. And drop a bit of that into the fold as well, so that it goes quite dark behind the bowl of fruit. And just a bit of water on that edge to lose the sharpness of the edges, so it's a bit softer. So I can muck around with that. You can put as much or as little in as you want. Now obviously into the vase itself you're going to have some of that blue tone coming through, so it's going to be blues and greens coming through. I'm going to drop them in wet and give the impression of the vase. Small brush, I think I'll drop some of the green in with the small brush. Can get a nice sharp edge on where the waterline is. You can barely see the edge of what's the background and what is the vase, but I'm just going to come in leave a little bit of rim, light, drop my greens in. The interior shape, again, you'll just be bringing in your darks, and in fact you can't see the edge of the rim at that point. It disappears behind the foliage, and then you just get a tiny hint of light catching the edge. And there's the edge of another leaf which I've yet to put in. Back to the blue that's coming through the vase on this side. again, while that's still wet, just dropping in a touch of green. And I'm just going to blur that across. It distorts slightly across the stems. Edge of dark below on the waterline. I'm going to let that dry now and see how that works out. But we're nearly done, or I'm nearly done on this demo. So I'm just going to let that dry. Now that it's dried, I just need to do a few odd extra things here very quickly. I can go back in and just darken up with some more blue on parts of the inside of the vase, just to get a little bit more of that reflective quality. Not a solid wash, but just a few strokes. On the inside, and I think I'll do a little bit over here as well, just with the blue. And on the other side also a few touches with my blue. Any other areas where you see the cloth coming through behind the plants. So there's the odd little bit where I'm just going to go in with blue on top. Obviously I haven't finished all my foliage, so I have areas of foliage that I'll need to put in. But that should give the effect of the sort of the translucence of the water. You might need to darken down some of the stems at the bottom. Obviously I've got more foliage to put in and the other side of my fabric to develop, but hopefully you can sort of see the basis of this. Now if there are one or two places on the edge of some of the flowers where you went over with the background, you can always retouch those with gouache. And one of the other things that I am going to do is my sunflowers have got a lot more spikes than I initially drew in with them. I can put those in gouache over the top of my dark blue background. Those of you who are working with a pale background, you should be able to actually look at the colours that are reflected in the background and wash those in with pale tones. So if you look at the photograph, you'll see some of the blue vases are reflecting shades of blue. So you can just use your very pale washes off of a big brush and put some of those in, sweeping through the fabric in the same way, but it's going to be a lot easier with a pale background. Some of you might decide not to put the dark background in, but to go pale, in which case what you need to think about is the colours you'll see through your vase will have to be, instead of being dark, they will be light from the cloth coming through behind. So you do have to take that into consideration, and you also won't get some of the dark colours reflecting up into the fruit as well. So if you change it, there is quite a bit that you need to change as well. But obviously The background is the most difficult part of this when you're working on reversing out with light flowers and a dark background, but it does look rather dramatic when you've finished. So I think I'm going to call it a day on the demo. There's lots more left to do on my picture. The only other thing I'll just quickly show you is I did finish the flower part of the light colours here. You can see, hopefully, I've finished all my flowers. I've got the foliage to go in and do properly, and then again the glassware and the fabric in exactly the same way. I've got that to finish off, but you can see what I was talking about in terms of the colour reflecting from some of the strong blues. You'll get that colour reflecting into the pale cloth. So the cloth will be done in light greys. For instance, if I'll just do a tiny bit on here, I've got sort of some warm, I can use a little bit of warm grey, and I would create the edge of the vase coming behind, not by painting the vase itself, but by using a warm grey tone and painting the cloth behind it. So if I put a little bit of wash in with a big brush here, and then immediately pick up some clean water and then fade that out with clean water. You can see the fabric's got some nice crisp edges in it, but I can fade that away, and it's picking up a hint of blue being reflected in it, so while it's still wet I can just pick up a tiny bit of blue and just touch little bits of blue into that fabric and wash it away. So again, soft edges, clean water, and I'm just going to keep that edge nice and sharp there, so just make sure that I keep that away. So it would be dropping colours in like that, but leaving some hard edges, so you don't need to, you haven't got the stress of bringing dark colour in and out, but you have got a lot of subtle colour changes to think about when you're trying to put the creases into the fabric. So you've got to put some colour down and then use water very carefully to soften your edges and create the folds. By using water. And not go too dark, that's the other thing. It's quite subtle, so it's lots of water and touching little bits of colour and deciding where you need to form an edge and where you need to keep the fabric white. So I can see I need to put a little bit of colour in here, and then I need to leave a touch of white paper for the crease. Pick up some more water. Pull it away with clean water. I would leave doing the vases till the end because you don't want the strength of the blue to bleed into what you're doing. So my advice would be to leave that until the very end and put the vases in afterwards, the blue vases that is, in afterwards. Otherwise I think you might run into a few difficulties. This water, softening my edges, and that's how I would start building up with the yellow, with the colour. I can see from the lemon, for instance, there's a little touch of yellow being caught in the reflection. do want to introduce a bit of blue, but I've got to be careful not to turn it green. To create my edge. Right, I think I'm going to call it a day because I can see the lights fading in the conservatory and this is getting darker and darker, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how to finish your painting.